the invoice that outlived the war. The First World War ended in 1918, but the bill did not. In 1919, at Versailles, Germany was not just defeated, it was invoiced, not in a symbolic way, in a legal, financial, and administrative way designed to last for decades. And what followed was not a simple story of Germany refused to pay. It was something more structural, a payment system built on politics, enforced through occupations, stabilized through foreign loans, and then broken by global depression. The reparations regime did not merely punish Germany, it reshaped Europe's money, it rewired capital flows, and it turned peace into a permanent financial negotiation. The trap wasn't one number on paper. The trap was the mechanism that turned a war into a balance sheet and tried to keep a defeated country solvent while extracting from it at the same time. So, what was Germany actually built? Why did the bill become unpayable? And why did the system ultimately end, not with full payment, but with suspension, renegotiation, and a quiet disappearance? Because the answer explains why the 1920s looked stable right until they weren't. What Versailles actually created. Versailles did not immediately set a single final number for reparations in 1919. It created a framework, a legal obligation tied to civilian damage, a commission to decide the schedule, and a political sentence that mattered far beyond its legal text. The so-called war guilt clause, Article 231. In practice, this did two things. First, it allowed reparations to be justified as compensation rather than tribute. Second, it ensured the issue would never be purely economic. It would be moral, political, and national. And once something becomes moral, it becomes difficult to renegotiate without looking weak. That's where the trap begins, not in the accounting, in the legitimacy. The number that poisoned the room. The famous figure came later. In 1921, the Allied Reparations Commission set Germany's reparations bill at 132 billion gold marks. It was a number large enough to satisfy public opinion in creditor countries and vague enough to postpone the hardest truth, what Germany could actually transfer year after year without breaking its currency. Even the structure of the bill reflected that tension. It was organized through bond series A, B, and C. The A and B bonds were treated as the practical core. The C bonds were more political theater, a way to keep the headline figure high without expecting full collection. This wasn't a hidden conspiracy. It was a political compromise designed to survive domestic pressure. But compromises with false numbers have a cost. They turn policy into performance, and performance rarely produces stability. Why the Allies insisted on payment. To understand the logic, you have to look at France and Britain, not just Germany. France had suffered massive physical destruction. Northern industrial regions were damaged. Infrastructure was shattered. The pressure to make Germany pay wasn't merely revenge, it was reconstruction. Britain, too, faced post-war debt burdens and political demands. And behind both stood another creditor, the United States. Inter-Allied war debts mattered because reparations weren't just about Germany paying France. They were about Europe settling a web of obligations created by total war. In other words, Europe tried to balance its post-war books using Germany as a revenue source. That meant reparations were never only punishment. They were part of the financing plan for peace. And that made them harder to reduce. Why Germany couldn't pay the way the bill required. Germany's economy after 1918 was not simply weak. It was politically unstable and fiscally constrained. The imperial system collapsed. Revolution and counter-revolution followed. The new Weimar state inherited obligations and social demands with a fragile tax base. Reparations required more than having resources. They required transfer. The ability to convert domestic revenue into foreign currency or goods on schedule without destroying the exchange rate. That's the key. A country can be productive and still be unable to transfer large external payments without triggering currency collapse, especially when political legitimacy is contested and taxation is unpopular. This is how economic problems become political problems, and how political problems become monetary problems. The first enforcement mechanism, occupation. By 1922, the reparations system was already strained. Payments in kind, coal, timber, goods, became central. When deliveries fell short, the creditor states treated it as default. And in early 1923, France and Belgium occupied the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, aimed at securing deliveries and enforcing the treaty. Here is where the reparations regime stops being accounting and becomes physical control of production. This is what makes it a trap. Once enforcement becomes occupation, compromise becomes harder because every concession looks like surrender and every delay looks like defiance. Passive resistance, the decision that broke the currency. Germany's response was passive resistance. Workers were encouraged to stop cooperating with the occupiers. Factories slowed, production fell, but the government still paid wages and subsidies, and it didn't have the revenue to do it. So it did what governments often do under impossible constraints. It printed. This is where reparations turn into hyperinflation, not by abstract theory, but by administrative necessity. The mark's fall in 1923 was catastrophic. 160,000 marks per US dollar on July 1st, 1923. 242 million marks per US dollar on October 1st. 4.2 trillion marks per US dollar on November 20th. That isn't just inflation, that is the destruction of money as a social contract. Savings wiped out, pensions erased, wages lagging behind prices, barter returning, middle class legitimacy collapsing. And when legitimacy collapses, extremism finds oxygen. Hold that thought, because the next phase looked like recovery, but it was built on something fragile. Stabilization did not solve the bill, it changed the payment method. In late 1923, Germany ended passive resistance. A new currency was introduced. Stabilization measures restored basic monetary function, but the reparations obligation did not disappear. The question became, how do you extract without collapsing the system again? The answer was not a new moral settlement, it was financial engineering. The Dawes Plan, payments restarted, but on credit. In 1924, the Dawes Plan reorganized the reparations problem. Crucially, it did not set a final total reparations figure. Instead, it set an annual schedule that began lower and rose over time. Payments were set to start at 1 billion gold marks in the first year, rising to 2.5 billion by 1928. It also reorganized German financial institutions and arranged an initial loan of 800 million marks to support stabilization. Here's the key mechanism. Germany would pay reparations using foreign capital inflows. This allowed the system to function without immediate collapse. It created the appearance of stability, and it rebuilt German industrial activity, but it introduced a new dependency, external credit. So the reparations trap evolved. It became a credit trap, the circular flow that kept Europe standing. By the mid-1920s, a circular system emerged. American capital flowed into Germany as loans. Germany used that stability to make reparations payments to the Allies. The Allies used those inflows to service war debts, particularly to the United States. This was not a conspiracy. It was the simplest way to make incompatible obligations appear compatible. But systems like this have one fatal weakness. They require confidence. If the lender stops lending, the entire circle breaks. And once the circle breaks, every part of the structure collapses at once. That is what happened after 1929. The truth that complicates the popular story. Here's the revealing part that many summaries skip. Over the full period, Germany's total reparations paid were far lower than the headline figures suggested. One authoritative estimate puts total payments around 36.1 billion marks over the post-war period. And during the same period, Germany borrowed about 33 billion marks from abroad, which means the net transfer, what Germany actually paid out in excess of what it received, was roughly 3.1 billion marks. This does not mean reparations were harmless. It means the burden was not only the size of payments. It was their timing, their symbolism, and their interaction with fragile institutions. The headline bill poisoned politics, the enforcement poisoned legitimacy, and the credit structure poisoned stability. Three different burdens compounding. The Young Plan, a final settlement that arrived too late. In 1929 till 1930, the Young Plan attempted to normalize the situation. It extended payments across decades and aimed to reduce international oversight of German economic life. It also helped create an institution designed to handle the mechanics of international settlements, the Bank for International Settlements, BIS, established in the context of implementing the Young Plan. On paper, this was the rational conclusion: along schedule, institutional administration, reduced political interference. But timing is everything. The world economy was about to enter a contraction that made long schedules meaningless, because the Young Plan still depended on the same hidden input: international credit. 1929, the moment the floor disappeared. The Great Depression was not just a fall in stock prices. It was a global credit shock. Capital retreated, risk tolerance collapsed, and Germany, deeply tied to foreign lending, was hit hard. When American lending tightened, Germany lost the inflows that made reparations manageable. Now the circular flow reversed. Instead of money entering Germany, money demanded to leave. Banks faced stress, confidence fractured. The system that had appeared stable in the late 1920s was revealed as conditional. It worked only under expansion. The Hoover Moratorium, an admission of impossibility. In June 1931, U.S. President Herbert Hoover announced a moratorium of intergovernmental debts, reparations, and relief debts. This was not charity, it was emergency stabilization. It was an admission that insisting on payment would spread panic through the financial system. The moratorium did not solve reparations, it bought time. But time doesn't fix a broken transfer mechanism if the underlying economy is contracting. Lausanne, 1932. The system ends in practice. In 1932, at Lausanne, the creditor powers acknowledged the reality. The world crisis made continued reparations payments impossible. The result was effectively liquidation, the de facto end of the reparations regime as a functioning system, not because the moral arguments vanished, but because the economics could no longer be enforced without destroying everyone involved. That is what trap means in international finance. A creditor can demand payment, but if enforcement collapses the debtor, and then collapses the wider system, the demand becomes self-defeating. The final irony: the bill didn't die, it went quiet. Even after the reparations system collapsed, parts of the financial architecture lingered in the form of obligations tied to the stabilization era. Decades later, Germany still had to service certain bonds connected to the post-Versailles financial settlements. And, in a symbolic twist, Germany made a final payment tied to the First World War era obligations in October 2010, connected to the interest on bonds issued under earlier settlement structures. The war ended in 1918. The financial tale lasted almost a century. That is what happens when politics is converted into dead instruments. The state may change, the regime may fall, but the contract survives. The structural lesson: Versailles did not fail because one number was too big. It failed because the system tried to do three incompatible things at once: punish a defeated state, stabilize that same state enough to keep Europe functional, and extract transfers without breaking its currency. The only way to make that work was credit. Credit made payments possible. Credit also made the system fragile. When global credit collapsed, the entire structure collapsed with it, and the political consequences did not remain contained. A reparations regime is not only an economic policy, it is a legitimacy policy. It tells people what is fair, what is owed, and who is to blame. When that story becomes unbearable, extremists offer simpler stories, and history shows that simpler stories often win. The invoice that destabilized a continent. The Treaty of Versailles did not create the Second World War by itself, but it built a post-war order where economics and politics were fused into a single mechanism of pressure. Germany was built, Europe tried to collect, money broke, credit patched the cracks, then credit broke too. The reparations trap was never just the bill, it was the system that made peace depend on transfers no one could sustain once the world turned downward. This record is preserved by vaults of value. We study what endured, what failed, and the patterns history leaves behind.